So a few weeks ago when I was thinking about this sermon, and I read the text for the day, and I realized it was a Sunday before Labor Day, I threw up my hands in despair and put it aside for the next 2 weeks. I could not figure that there would be any connection. But then I went back and actually reread that story. And every once in a while, God is just really good. God takes mercy on pastors who try to come up with something to say every single week. Because this is the absolute right story for Labor Day Sunday. Why? Because here Moses is, as a shepherd in his workaday world, minding his own business, minding his father-in-law's business, and right then and there, God comes. That burning bush that is not consumed, and that voice that says, "Take off your shoes, you are on holy ground." I mean, God just sort of lobbed one to the preacher that day. Because what it means is that if that holy ground out in the desert wilderness, with probably some sheep dung around it on occasion, that ground is sacred. And if that ground could be sacred, and that moment could be a time when Moses experiences God's presence in his workaday life, then surely God can be present in all the other places that God calls you and me. Whether it's the work of a parent, the work of an administrator, the work of a doctor, the work of a spouse, the work of a volunteer, whatever it might be, God is present. And that ground is holy. And so rather than trying to spin that out in a sermon from my own making, I sort of picked a random group from the congregation, not random people, just a random group of people, and wrote to them and asked them some questions. How do you experience your work as being on holy ground? How do you know God's presence? How do you not know God's presence? And how do you know the work that God calls you to do? So I'd like to simply share with you this morning some of their responses, some of which have been edited down because we have a very, very wise congregation. One of the things that I learned about the work that people do in this congregation, again, whether it's volunteer service or paid or whatever, is that work is an important part of community for them. Owen Gimmer, who's a young man who comes to the 8:30 service and is a student at St. John's College, wrote this in all of the earnestness of a St. John's College student. I love sharing what I'm about to write with people because it is one of my favorite parts of going to St. John's. The school seems to be very intentional about making seminar a sacred and holy thing. The entire undergraduate community has seminar every Monday and Thursday, and every grade is reading the same thing. 6 groups reading the Iliad, 6 reading Genesis, 6 reading Descartes, 6 reading Hegel. The program is our lectionary. Over dinner, we discuss our readings and wonder where the conversation might lead. At 7:15, the bell in the clock tower rings, signaling us to head to our respective classrooms, our call to prayer. Before we officially start, there's always lots of mingling and often goofing around and bantering. But when a tutor begins his or her opening question, it's all seriousness as we all attempt to work together to try and figure out what these great books have to teach us. It's always an incredibly communal night that we get to share together twice a week. And all of St. John's, but especially each of our seminar classrooms, feels like holy ground. Katrina Storm, who also comes to the early service, is a paralegal and also a volunteer docent over at the O'Keeffe Museum. She wrote about being a volunteer docent, but she also wrote about being a paralegal. As you know, I work for lawyers all week, averaging 40 to 45 hours a week. The attorneys represent large corporations and do some pro bono work. Don't get me wrong, they are a good group of men and women that are very good at what they do. My work relates to each and every person in the office, by phone calls, making files, ordering supplies, making coffee. I can lift their spirits on their hardest days with a joke or a chocolate at the front desk. I am their support group in so many ways. Anyone who has ever relied on an administrative assistant knows what an important ministry that is. Betsy Ross is a physical therapist, a mom, a wife, and she wrote this: I work in healthcare, taking care of critically ill patients in the hospital and helping them gain function and mobility. God's presence is here when we recognize the humanity and the individuality of every person, when we acknowledge the activities in which they participate in their everyday lives, and we look at the whole person rather than the disease. God's presence is here when we are able to add meaning and quality to a person's life, even when medicine can't always add years. Wendy Russell directed church choir here in Santa Fe for over 2 decades. She titled hers "My 4x4 Patch of Holy Ground." The carpeted 4x4 conducting podium would certainly never be described as holy. A rather plain, unassuming, but sturdy wooden box covered by carpet to keep my heels from clicking. As I stood on that piece of holy ground on Wednesday night and Sunday morning, I saw each face as an individual child of God, a miracle in progress. Each person working hard to grow into grace and understanding, knowing that God's love was there for them all the time and in all the places they found themselves. I would look out into that sea of faces and behold lives that were far from perfect, but rather were being perfected in faith. My burning bush was full of faces, loving, trusting, determined, God-centered people who showed up religiously to practice and to worship. They often felt broken at the beginning of rehearsal, but ready to work towards and claim their healing. And there were times when they sang that I could not look at them because they were so radiant, so transformed by what they were singing. I did indeed feel like Moses before the burning bush. Saram Mangus is a lawyer who does a lot of immigration work. Earlier this summer, wrote Sarah, I attended the annual conference of the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, 500 representatives and attorneys. During one particularly heartbreaking session, I looked out over the room and knew that with this many people all working to protect the lives of undocumented immigrants and refugees, the Holy Spirit was truly among us. I heard from educators as well, and how it is classrooms and schools can be places of holiness. Natalie Gagos, who teaches young children, my holy ground in my work is not the 4 rooms of my classroom or the halls of my school. It lies within the connection that I create and nurture with my students. In this uncertain world, students need to learn the power of connection and how through connection we can all work toward tolerance, inclusion, renewed understanding, and perspective. Imagine a group of students that could unleash the power of connection and use those connections to rebuild our communities and our relationships with our neighbors, both local and global. The potential is limitless. God led me to be a part of this amazing journey of learning and connection, and all that I am, I'm humbly grateful and awed by the opportunity. Jack Lane, longtime member of the congregation, who's the school principal over at El Camino Real. I find holiness in the engaged eyes of students when observing classes, whether it is 7th grade students talking excitedly about their writing or pre-K students interacting during play centers in the drama area. And the classroom for me is holy because caring adults, the teachers, make it so through thought, work, and time, even if they're not compensated far enough. Mark Black is a chimney sweep. Some of you may recognize him because he is also our barbecuer par excellence. Mark wrote about his work as a chimney sweep. Some years ago, I read a book called Shibumi, to have a book about a Japanese set of concepts that apply directly to work of all sorts. Let me explain. Shibumi is the appearance of effortless perfection in the act of participating in a practice. Shibui is the apparent lack of a creator in a created thing. So some examples from sweeping chimneys. Every move I make must be devoid of wasted motion or extra effort because time is profit. Every procedure in chimney sweeping has to be lawsuit-proof and within specific protocols, or I get sued. There is very little room for error. And when I leave, the house should look like no one was ever there, except that it will be cleaner. The action should appear to be effortless, and the results like a natural evolution occurred. Gary Johnston is a greeter at Home Depot. Put Home Depot, big box stores, greeters in a completely different perspective. He wrote, "I'm not sure of the holiness in a simple greeting. However, I do meet a lot of interesting people coming through the doors of Home Depot. There are those who are surprised at a simple greeting of hello, who have like a deer in the headlight look. Those who beam when told hello or good morning and return the greeting with a smile and a hello. Then there are those who stare at you after a friendly hello with a look of, leave me alone, I don't want to be bothered. Those are the ones who wouldn't smile to save their souls. And lastly, there are the followers who are like lost sheep being led to slaughter, who will follow you throughout the entire store, searching for what they believe they need." Just thought I would share what I see on a daily basis. Sometimes connecting with people is hard in work. Blanca Surgeon, many of you know, works in water projects with small rural communities all throughout not just New Mexico, but throughout this country and indeed around the world. She wrote this, "In our work with small water utilities in rural America, we try to get the very small communities to come together as a region to be a stronger voice, to have a better opportunity for funding, and to build resiliency through economies of scale. In one community-wide meeting in a small town in California, one of the poorest communities in the whole country, my colleague and I were discussing how that particular town could collaborate with the only nearby neighbor of another town. We stated the benefits and the issues that both communities had in common. But at one point in the meeting, a man stood up and said, 'I consider this an act of terrorism. How dare you come and propose this idea to us?' He continued to ask us to leave. My colleague and I looked at each other, and at that moment I knew I was on holy ground because we were somehow calmed. And then someone else from the community stood up and said, 'We could benefit from working together.' She shifted the entire conversation. Others began to support the idea, and actually the meeting ended very positive." Rebecca Griego, just a few more, but these are ways of learning who we are in this congregation. Rebecca Griego, many of us know because she is the Nurture Center coordinator, but she works Monday through Friday, and oftentimes on weekends, as a state legislative administrator. She said, "I want to share a personal story as it relates to holy ground. That we find God's will even and perhaps especially in the little things we do that no one ever notices. Indeed, little things matter so much to us because they matter so much to God. I struggled with my position as a records officer and the low pay at the legislature since I'd been a paralegal making better pay years before. But then one day I woke up and realized it wasn't about the pay, and it wasn't about the title. It was about doing my best and offering my work up to God, no matter what I was doing or how much money I made. I was grateful for the enlightenment, and I thank God every day for my employers who have made it possible for me to continue my life in Santa Fe and all the wonderful graces God has blessed me with." Rachel Baker, our children's ministry director, leads into the section on connecting to creation and how our work can do that. "The less instruction and direction I give, the more the children surprise and delight me by exploring and appreciating creation. They appreciate the holiness of worms, rocks, seeds, and trees. I'm just there to look out for cacti and make sure they don't try to eat any of their discoveries." Sharon Elias is a soil conservationist in our congregation, working also for the federal government. "I think my holy ground is when I'm working with a producer or a farmer, and we dig a clod of soil from the field and examine all that is in that piece of earth. Looking at the structure, the minuscule roots, large sand pieces together with the smaller clay and silt particles, and of course, the smell. It is a peaceful feeling when this occurs. And one last one about holy ground that is all creation, from Linda Churchill, who is a professional landscaper and also heads up our landscaping task force here at the church. Thanks be to God. She wrote in part, "Was it Rumi who wrote, 'There are 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the ground'? I guess I get to do that more literally than some. I am truly blessed in my work. I'm a being of the earth, and I love the earth and all its abundance, and I have figured out a way to make a living helping care for the earth as well. Working as a gardener and a landscaper can be challenging in many ways. It is very physical work, and sometimes I'm just too tired at the end of the day to do much more than to eat and go to sleep. And also sometimes it's hard work because you have to work with people and create their ideas in the landscape. But when I go to bed exhausted from my work, I try to remember to thank God for being able to be part of this whole wonderful symbiosis that is life. And yes, I do get to experience the awe of the world, perhaps a little more than some. Seeing a garden glimmer in the light of summer dawn can bring me to tears. Seeing delicate mouse tracks in the first snow or watching an apple blossom open to the sun is a gift. Early one frosty November morning, when I was working on the Church Reflection Trail planting project, the trail that is out between here and St. Michael's Drive, I watched a beautiful russet coyote slowly cross the property. She had a rabbit in her mouth. She saw me watching her, but was not alarmed, and we acknowledged one another with the respect of beings who both have lives to live and work to accomplish. I don't know how I could be closer to God than this. Cheryl Haskins wrote about answering the call. She says that she finds holy ground when she finds that she must answer the call even when it's not convenient. An example. At a social gathering, some friends mentioned that their daughter was going to school for the first time in 4 years. She'd been homeschooled since 2nd grade. I didn't have to mention that I was a math tutor, and I kept telling myself to keep my mouth shut. I had enough to do with a summer job, cancer treatments, and then what about when school started again? But I didn't. And as a result, the student is making good gains and she needs the help. I guess I would have to sum it up to say it is holy ground everywhere where one is keeping their eyes, ears, and heart open to receive that call. Joanna Tovar, who is a general practitioner in Espanola, wrote about what it is she receives from standing on such holy ground in working with patients. I experience holy ground countless times every day at work, when patient after patient after patient ask about my children, give me advice about my kids or about raising children, share stories and pictures with me about their children. I see a lot of grandparents. When patients who have suffered incredible obstacles in their lives, the loss of one or more children, addiction, poverty, all of the above, share their wisdom with me. I thought I would have a huge list, Talitha, but it's really just these two, just over and over and over again. And one final reflection from the congregation. From Pam Hyde, who has spent almost her entire working life working for governments, whether it's state, county, federal. She retired a couple years ago from directing the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration of the Obama administration, and she is officially retired, although she works seemingly full-time for the county, the city, and also works leading our initiation program here at the church. But she's retired. So she says, she wrote, given what I've done over the years, mostly working for politicians and in government, I almost always have to leave in the middle of things. I've gotten pretty good at leaving a job, a group of people, a set of programs and process. It's taught me how to let go, even of things I poured my heart and soul into. I've also always felt blessed to see things I've started or worked on continue after me, change and evolve, usually for the better, even after I've gone. It gives me a sense of hope and pleasure to know that I'm part of something, not the whole of something. I like to think I make a difference, but I get even more out of knowing that I'm just one part of a larger whole that keeps on going, and with the impact I've made, but far beyond me or my brief time. Even when things I've worked on or started get changed or stopped after I'm gone because the next leader doesn't agree or has different priorities, I can almost always see how what I've impacted has gotten embedded in the values, rules, directions, or understandings of those who remain there or go on to a different activity or position under a new leader and in those new priorities. I'm also always amazed and amused that, quote, they like you better when you're gone, end quote. That is, they remember you positively and miss you, even if they beat up on you endlessly or ignored you while you were there. Pam, Archbishop Oscar Romero would agree with you. And I offer his final reflection. Just as Moses was not allowed to go into the promised land, but send his people on ahead of him 40 years after leading those people, just as Pam reminds us that the work goes on even after we're long gone, Archbishop Oscar Romero, the martyr of El Salvador, wrote these words just days before he was assassinated by death squads. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something, and to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future, not our own. Take off your shoes for the ground on which you stand, and work, and serve, and love, and live, and hope is holy. Thanks be to God. Amen.